Hello and welcome back to Introduction to International Relations. For this seventh session, we're going to be looking at feminism and feminist approaches to international relations. And I emphasize approaches because feminist thought, as broadly speaking, having this social ontology or this socially constructivist and critical theory approach, has a range of different approaches that make up a rich school of thought that is feminism. And my remarks today will focus on international relations because feminist thinkers and feminist activists have, of course, made huge contributions, not only in the world itself and the world that we ourselves make, but also in academia, whether in the social sciences or the humanities. And so specifically, I focus my remarks on IR feminism, but I will refer to key feminist thinkers such as Judith Butler as the presentation unfolds. And now what I would like to do is share my screen with you and go into the presentation directly. So again, as I've done in previous presentations in INIR, I have a picture with some text, so an image and some text that goes with it, that accompanies it in this case. And I just want you to have a quick look at this image and the wording. And this is a poster, as you can see, the United States Navy recruiting station, a post-First World War image to encourage people to join the Navy. But when we say people, who are we actually talking about? And we're going to see how language and images constructs certain hierarchies between different groups, and in this case, between two different genders, male, female, but we'll be looking at this in a second. So if I may, because I think you've now had a good amount of time to look at the image and the text, I will just read it for you. G, US English, G, I wish I were a man. I would join the Navy. Be a man and do it. So as you can see from this image and this text, okay, in 2020 United States, this type of wording would not be appropriate, but we can see how things are constructed over time. And we can see here in this image, in the post-First World War context, to be this notion, so this gendered notion of what it means to be brave, masculine, doing the right thing for one's country and therefore for the world at large. According to the US government, one needed to be a man. And to be a man, you were therefore brave, strong, rational. As we will see that some of these ideas, whilst they might be more subtle today, still accompany some of our belief systems and assumptions that we have about how the world is. And when I say we, I use the royal we, but I also want to emphasize how policymakers think about the world and how they may themselves play a role in reproducing particular power relations. And so when we look at an image like this, and for any image you look at, so any image you look at in a magazine, how women are portrayed, how men are portrayed, this is what feminists think, and in the media more broadly, and how that impacts on politics, how it impacts on people's lives on let's say on the ground, in a daily interaction. We will see how there are cultural constructivist aspects that socialize us to believe what it means to be male or female, and what is good and what is not so good. And before I go into feminist IR scholarship more broadly and more directly, I should say, I just want to clarify some concepts. There is always this notion of nature and nurture, and the vast majority of feminist thinkers are not disregarding biology or sex equaling biology. There is some schools of thought and post-structuralist feminist thinkers, Judith Butler being a very, very important feminist post-structuralist thinker more broadly in the humanities, that would challenge that whether biology or sex that I put in red has any impact on how the world works. But actually, I'm going to make the argument that actually it's both sex and gender. So biology does matter. There is an aspect of nature to how the world is. And so males having or men having testosterone does play a role in how the world works. However, with that stated, and so sex chromosomes, females carrying XX chromosomes, males carrying XY chromosome, And of course, there are exceptions to every rule, but nonetheless, females carrying XX chromosomes, males carrying XY chromosomes has certain implications, biological, and sex being the term I use as a synonym for biology here. At the same time, and this is very, very, very important for feminist thinkers, and a key aspect, there is a nurture aspect, which is argued to be even more important than a nature aspect, and it's gender. Gender, as we can see in red here, the second point, and how things are socially constructed, especially in the social world. And you may remember from the constructivist slides that we came across in the previous presentation, feminism as a school of thought comes under this broad umbrella of constructivism and more broadly critical approaches or critical theory, critical approaches to international relations. So challenges realism and liberalism, these more what would be thought of as we may remember from critical theory, the last presentation, challenges these more mainstream approaches that just want to reinforce particular power relations. It actually opens up the box and says, look at how we whether political leaders, we as social movements, we construct, and therefore we have possibilities to reconstruct, to challenge some of these power hierarchies, not just between men and women, although that is very important, but in all different ways. So gender being a social construct here. And this is something that feminist thinkers across IR feminist thought that and approaches that I'm going to be going into in more detail: liberalism, constructivism, critical theory, post-structuralism, post-colonialism. This is shared across the board, that gender is socially constructed, and how there are hierarchies and how we can challenge these hierarchies is something that we need to consider through feminist approaches. And again, as I've just stated, there are many different feminist theories. There's not just one, and here I've put liberalism, constructivism, critical, excuse me, there should be a comma between constructivist and critical approaches, post-colonial and post-structural. And here we have great thinkers like Martha Nussbaum, who is put in a more liberal feminist approach, and Tinkner, who would be considered a more constructivist feminist, Cynthia Enloe, more critical feminist, Judith Butler, a post-structural feminist, and there are many other important scholars, but I just put a few names there. As an important, let's say, rule of thumb, it looks at how and why women are subordinated to men in the world, and why this is the case. And yes, there has been progress made. Most feminist thinkers would acknowledge there's been significant progress made over the last, let's say, century, what have you. But still there's subordination, still there's, let's say, mindsets and belief systems and ideas that play a role in why there is inequality in many different ways, but particularly in this case between men and women. And again, so this notion also in the societies we live in, that actually masculinity and femininity, and from a feminist approach, actually how masculinity is sometimes emphasized as in a hierarchical way, as the more attractive approach to be, and now I'm going to use feminist language here that is used by many in the political world, in the media and so on, that let's say to be rational, to be logical, etc. These are more male qualities, whereas female qualities are more emotional, less logical, etc., etc. And again, there's a lot to challenge on that, and in many ways, to those of you listening right now, it's nonsense to say that it's one or the other, and that females and males, XX, XY chromosome female, XY males, actually are both rational and can sometimes be irrational, can be logical, can be illogical, can be strong, can be weak, however we define these terms. But the key point here is that we can see how language and images are gendered and used, as I showed you from the first slide, to how we represent ourselves and the world at large. And again, as I was emphasizing in the previous slide, there's a social hierarchy, that masculine characteristics to be strong, to be brave. And again, it doesn't mean that feminine qualities are not being brave, but it's emphasized here that it's to be rational, to be strong in a particular way, creates a particular hierarchy. And yes, often, not always, and there are cases, of course, where women can be in a more advantageous place in societies, but as a rule of thumb, it also distinguishes why men are in a more powerful position than women. And historically, you could see it in a whole host of ways, but even today in more subtle ways. How men are portrayed and how women are portrayed, sometimes doing exactly the same thing, and yet a male, the representation of a man will be deemed and done, in a more positive light. So we have to look at how gender and how things are socialized in global politics. Why, in a sense, certain jobs are valued more than others. Why, let's say, we consider, as realists do, that actually policymakers who have to think of the objective national interests, as we know with realism, this anarchical world we live in, how that actually has implications for people on the ground, sometimes thousands of miles away, and who are affected. Well, men are of course affected, but women and children in particular, and how it emphasizes a particular reproduction of power relations in the world at large. So IR feminism, again, as a rich and many different approaches, but as one now, as a theory, IR feminism, within IR theory, it really starts to have an impact, or more of an impact, increasingly towards, again, like with constructivism, towards the end of the Cold War, late 80s, going in now into the 1990s. And that actually we have to consider gender analysis. So we have to look at how women and men, what their roles are, whether it's political economy, whether it's security. So again, if you're a realist, you're talking about this objective national interest, and yet you're talking about invading a country thousands of miles away. How does it impact people on the ground? So feminism, contra, let's say, these more mainstream approaches, realism and liberalism, looks at how people's lives are affected on the ground. So it looks at not just, as you could say, with realism and liberalism, which one could argue as a top-down approach. It's more complicated than that. But feminist approaches also very much emphasize a bottom-up. So looking at how people's lives on the ground are impacted, whether individually, as a group, etc., etc. And a post-positivist commitment to examining the relationship between power and knowledge. So the language and images that we use are not neutral. So it challenges realist and liberal institutionalist approaches, and some structural Marxist approach and structural Marxism too. It challenges, let's say, positivist notions that we can study the social world the way we can the natural world. Actually, how we use language and images, how we represent groups of people. So how, when we think of a horrible social phenomenon like racism, how a black person might be represented differently to a white person doing the same action. So it reinforces particular power and knowledge and hierarchies. And again, the emphasis here, with an emphasis on women and women's experiences, because we're looking at feminism, of course, and we're looking at how knowledge itself, epistemology, is often, in the social world in particular, emphasizing here, is often has been historically, socially, culturally created by men for the purposes of benefiting men. So notions of here, let's say, meritocracy, the best person for the position, in and of itself, it's innocent, it sounds right, it sounds appropriate, but nonetheless, it ignores a whole host of factors that have already given men an advantage over women, historically, but also in today's world, according to feminist thinkers, critical and otherwise. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize how there are different aspects of feminism as the presentation proceeds. But we have to challenge, as feminists now, we have to look at social relations, how images, languages, and practices create, construct, and again, constructivism, this social ontological approach that feminism is under the umbrella of constructivism more broadly. And so notions of anarchy, this notion, as we know within realist thought, let's say there's no supranational authority, no world government to protect us, and therefore nation states, realism now, nation states need to protect themselves and have let's say, survive, and in some cases develop their power vis-a-vis others. Actually, feminists say, well, actually, this so-called international system that realists have constructed as well, according to feminist thinkers, has actually also created this gender hierarchies. And also, and we'll get to post-colonial, whether it's race or inequality in the world, it's also done to, let's say, again, reinforce and put certain groups in more powerful position than others. And groups can also, of course, mean states and non-state actors more broadly. And again, I want to emphasize or re-emphasize this grassroots aspect. So bottom up can be both bottom up and top down, but actually we have to look at the micro level. How are people's lives affected more? So not so much here, policymakers, people in particularly powerful position, men or women, of course, but also how people's lives are affected, particularly marginalized factors, individuals and groups. So thus far, when we've been looking at theory, international relations theory, in, let's say, when we talk particularly about realism or liberalism, etc., we look at how policymakers and other powerful individuals and groups have had a clear and direct impact on how the world is, how it's made up, and so on. But actually, it silences other voices, more marginalized voices, so people being affected by a policy. So when you have, let's say, the example of the Anglo-Dutch energy company Shell in the 1990s in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, exploiting local people in the Niger Delta, impacting on people's lives, we have to look at the particular communities that are affected and the relationship between Shell, the energy company, and the Nigerian government. We don't just look at these powerful state and non-state actors, we also need to look at how people's lives are affected on the ground. And this is one of the added values of feminist thinking. And again, critical theory feminism, and arguably feminism, as I said, a constructivist approach, has always a critical theory approach to it, that we have to think that actually, eventually, and the point of it is we look at, let's say, critically this relationship between men and women, but it's actually, and this is the critical theory aspect about it, it challenges not only, let's say, what it means to be a man or a woman, and that's the critical theory aspect to it, but also, according to this critical theory feminism, it looks at how we can emancipate everybody. So it's not just for the benefit of women, which is sometimes a critique that's made against feminist thinking. It's actually a way of how do we emancipate everybody? How do we do something that actually benefits men as well, so they don't have to do a particular stereotype, play a particular role, that they too can be liberated, and actually make the world, as much as I let's say, sometimes we can be skeptical here, but make the world in some ways a better place, because we can challenge these hierarchies and we can produce an order which is more equal and actually empowers everyone and not just one group over another. So here are the different types and schools of thought within feminist IR theory. Martha Nussbaum is actually more a political theorist, so she's not directly, but I think she's such a key thinker that I wanted to put her name as one of the key thinkers that I want you to come across and read her work and read the others. That liberal feminists, firstly, take a more mainstream approach. And actually, some liberal feminists, not necessarily Nussbaum herself, but actually take this more positivistic approach that we can actually measure, and we can, so the United Nations Human Development Index, and we can look at how, let's say, there's less inequality between men and women. But a key thing for liberal feminists now is if we can remove legal obstacles and we can create the conditions for actually equality between men and women, legally speaking, there are no, let's say, legal obstacles, and we create the opportunities both for men and women, then actually we've, broadly speaking, done the important work in terms of creating gender equality and in terms of actually creating a fairer society. So liberal feminists look at, let's say, removing legal and political obstacles to create a path where there can actually be more equality across the board. You remove legal obstacles and you've done very important part of the work. Now what we're going to see is how this is very limited according to more critical or constructivist approaches. And a key feminist critical theorist is Cynthia Enloe, someone that I highly, highly recommend and encourage you to read her work, both her books and articles, and you can see her on YouTube. And we look at how both ideas and material structures are, and ideas and material factors, according to critical theory, are interrelated, impact on each other. How, let's say, playing a role, let's say, whether working for an international organization or for a government, how, let's say, certain structures, factors, ideas, material factors are reinforcing of how we do things. And we need to see beyond it. We need to look at these power structures. We need to critique it. We need to think about our language and how things are gendered, and we have to challenge it. So what it means, let's say, to do work, and why is it that some jobs are deemed, let's say, more prestigious, some less prestigious, and even, let's say, having childcare, giving birth to a child. Why is it, let's say, that raising a child is seen somehow as not work? All of these things we have to think about. And from a critical theorist point of view, this grassroots movement, how are people's lives, particularly women now, but how are people's lives impacted by international organizations? How does it, let's say, whether a domestic worker in certain Gulf countries, Gulf Arab countries, who are treated as slaves, that might be an extreme example, but how are people's lives impacted in many different societies across the country, and how do we challenge it? And how do these international organizations, where the more powerful state actors, and sometimes non-state actors, but we're talking about IOs, state actors, actually implicate how the world works, and therefore factor into how some groups are doing better than others? So an example, often in conflicts, when we look at the military, which I'm going to be looking at later with you as one of the case studies, we look at, let's say, how the military is there to protect others. But actually, we can see, empirically speaking, how it often engenders insecurity, instability, and in some cases, women doing various jobs. I've referred to domestic workers, but also sex work and other, let's say, professions, etc., how that is created through this conflictual situation. So it becomes a necessity for some, and I use the example of sex workers, as Cynthia Enlow's work, that actually, in a sense, reinforces certain power structures. So when you have the US or some other powerful state actor with its military bases in some countries using some of these sex workers, and there's a lot of empirical evidence for this, and how and in what way feminist thinkers themselves can challenge this to say, actually, we can see that often the military can be a negative rather than, in its own words, a positive. Feminist constructivists, but I'll go into more detail later on in this presentation on that. Feminist constructivists, and another important, J.Ann Tinkner, shows us how ideas about gender shape and are shaped by global politics. So again, language, images, what it means to be strong, what it means to take on others, etc., etc. You can see with COVID-19, a number of, let's say, women leaders have been purportedly done a better, political leaders have done a better job than their male counterparts, and yet is this, let's say, 9 times out of 10, it's often the case that the men are portrayed as historically, at least, as the strong ones, the ones who do things in the right way, etc., etc. So we can see that over time, and from a feminist constructivist point of view, let's say women leaders, whether the New Zealand Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, etc., that actually these political, so whether we talk about Ahern or Merkel, etc., that these particular leaders are challenging actually what it means to be a good leader. What it means to be a good leader. But historically, of course, women, historically in particular, but even today sometimes in some parts of the world, that women was not deemed as being capable of having leadership qualities. But we can see by having empathy, by having certain, let's say, connections with others, that it can actually improve public policy. Now, 2 other schools of thought or approaches within this broad umbrella that is feminist thinking, and post-structuralist, I put / postmodern feminist thinkers. Judith Butler is a huge figure within, let's say, feminist post-structuralist thought more broadly. And I won't go into great detail on this, but I just want to, because I want to emphasize the key tenets of post-structuralist thought, post-structuralist feminist thought. But again, as per that first image that you saw of, gee, I wish I were a man, be a man and do it, joining the Navy or the military, whatever the case might be, but how knowledge and power is constructed and reconstructed, and how language is used, again, this is what makes it post-structuralist, to create certain hierarchies between different groups in a society, and how we use language. So think about it, when you use the word terms like civilized versus uncivilized. So we are civilized, they are barbaric. you can see how policymakers might use that to convince their audience, whether it's public opinion, other elites, of an appropriate course of action by defining us as we, civilized, they, barbaric, order versus anarchy. In this case, chaos, actually the term anarchy meaning chaos, not anarchical system as in realism here, but order. There's order, this is the right, this is appropriate, and then there's anarchy. If we don't have order, everything would be chaotic, lawless, etc., etc., developed and underdeveloped. It's why certain critical economists don't always like terms like backward economies, underdeveloped, even how we use language. So when we talk about a developing economy, that's better than saying an underdeveloped economy, but we can see that language plays an important role in how we see some countries and other countries. And so we always need to look at text. We always need to look at policymakers and how they use language, how they, let's say, construct a particular meaning when they talk about groups of people in a particular way, and whether its audience believes in what the actual policymaker or politician is saying. And so we look at, with this post-structuralist thought, we look at this binary categorization between, here's an obvious thing, between good versus evil in the world, and how it constructs, if you want to be on the good side, on the civilized side, that's one thing, and we are against evil. And if you don't follow us, then actually you are part of the problem. You are perhaps even part of the evil that exists in the world, to use this binary conception. And post-structuralists challenge this. They look at how language is used, how images are used, and they deconstruct. They say, what does it mean? So there's in gender, and to Judith Butler here, Gender Trouble, her great work, and gender fluidity, but more broadly in international relations, how power is reproduced to create, again, these hierarchies that we need to challenge, according to post-structuralist feminist thinkers. And a final school of thought within feminists, so I've covered a broad ground again, just in this presentation, is post-colonial feminist thinkers. And a very important thinker here is Chandri Mohanty. And what Mohanty looks at, and it looks at, when we look at, let's say, feminist thinking, and we look at liberal feminist thinking, that, like you've come across in the previous slide, and remove legal and political obstacles and all will be well, to simplify liberal feminist thinkers. Actually, and this is where post-colonial feminist challenges it, there are some women who are in a very privileged position. So if you are white, middle class, living, let's say, in London or in the East Coast, New York, Boston, Washington, DC, what have you, in the United States, you have a very different, and you're a policymaker, maybe you're a powerful policymaker, you have a very different life experience to someone in a developing economy or developing country living on the fringe of that particular society. So we have to bring in a broad range of different sociological phenomena. So when we look at race and how we know the abhorrent aspect of racism, not just in developing countries, but we know in developed countries too, which exists, we need to look at class. How does class, whether we talk about working class, middle class, etc., the class system, and geographical location. Again, going back to my example, if you are living in New York, or you're living in a village in a developing country in West Africa, as an example might be, you have a very different life experience. And what I'm certainly not going to say is that one is right, one is wrong, but we can see how someone can be in a more powerful, privileged position, and therefore gives them certain opportunities politically, in their individual lives. So even this notion of meritocracy is a bit of a myth when we think that not all even start in the same position. So post-colonial feminist thinkers, as our lens of analysis, we need to bring in race. How let's say, race is used in the world at large, how racism, one's skin pigmentation, etc., but also, let's say, how other, let's say, gendered but also socially constructed categories, so whether we talk about religion or other, let's say, belief systems, how that also plays a role. So when you look at, let's say, racism or anti-Semitism, etc., that exists in the world, how that has subordinated many. But again, and here we take on the post-colonial feminist thinkers, that it's women's subordination, also race. So a black woman living in a small village in Northwest Nigeria has a different experience to a white upper middle class woman living in New York. So we have to consider race, class, and post-colonial feminists are therefore critical of liberal feminists and other more, or what they deem more mainstream approaches. Class, you can't ignore class because it's there and it's a part of the equation. And so there's a connection here with Marxism, one could argue. But actually class plays a role. What class are we a part of? If you're a cleaner, or if you're the CEO of a company, of let's say a multinational corporation, MNC, again, it's very different. Who are we advocating for? Who are we fighting for in a society? And again, geographical location. All of these factors matter, which some of these other feminist approaches don't take into enough account, according to post-colonial feminist thinkers, Chandra Mohanty and others. Now, different methodological approaches, but basic arguments. So again, gender has to be considered. We need a gender lens to understand the world at large. So nature and nurture, it's not one or the other. But sex and gender are both important, but how gender plays a very significant role in the social world that we live in of international relations. So is it human nature or nurture which leads to violence and war? Man, the bold human nature or nurture which leads to violence and war. As you can see from realist thinkers and some liberals as well, but particularly realists, they are pessimistic about, and classical realism is a good example here of human nature. And therefore there's an element of pessimism and why there's conflict, why there's war, why there's violence in the world, because of our human nature. But according to feminist thinkers, again, gender being front and center here, when we're looking at the social world, it's nurture, largely speaking, that leads to a more violent conflict way, or to a more peaceful, cooperative way. We have choice. This is nurture. And actually, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, this realist thinking, that actually we need to be pessimistic, we need to protect ourselves, etc., etc. Is that not just constructing a more conflictual world, according to feminist thinking? And again, as in international relations, post-First World War context, realism and other theories, mainstream theories, has it not just constructed a truth that we now take for granted, but by using language, using ideas, certain theories that became front and center, have we not just constructed a truth about how the world is? And actually we've constituted this conflictual world. It's post-positivistic, according to most feminist thinkers, in that we've constituted this world through our language and our practices. It's not something outside, so an explanatory theory. It's something that we make and we remake, hence a constructivist element to it. And now, deconstructing truths. Here we've got Antigna's work, Gender in International Relations, from 1992. So from approximately 30 years ago, but I just want to put in this statistic to emphasize a few things. So 80 to 90% of casualties since the Second World War have been civilian, and majority women and children. So again, because we'll be looking at the military and we're looking at war as a protector of women and children, and how policymakers argue this point, the actual results on the ground is far worse and actually is the opposite. It actually harms women and children and men. Global refugee population, again, women and children are very high percentage, and violence against women is higher in militarized societies and military families. So militarized society, this notion of a society, whether we think of Pakistan or Turkey as let's say militarized societies, you would need to look at a range of societies and look at where violence takes place and so on and so forth. But again, and this is the key point I want to make, this notion that policymakers construct, and especially historically, that male soldiers are there to protect women and children, we have to challenge this, deconstruct it, according to critical and post-structuralist feminist thinkers. Some observations, empirical observations, that actually low-paid wage labor for northern multinational corporations, MNCs, and domestic servants for northern households, and servants, by the way, when we talk about Gulf Arab states, can literally be, the word can be used appropriately, but we can look at how, let's say, informal, notions of slavery, or how people are forced to do certain jobs because they have no other option. And we can see that women, again, are disproportionately represented in lower paid jobs through no fault of their own. And when we get to recessions or even depressions, it's women that end up usually, not always, and this is changing and being challenged, as we can see with this constructivist approach, but it's women that end up caring for elderly and the sick. And we can look at how some of the major international financial institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank have historically impacted in a negative sense heavily on women, haven't actually helped women necessarily historically. And again, I'm just citing a few feminist observations. Some of these points that I've made in this slide and the previous slide can be challenged, but I just want us to think critically about this world that we live in and who it benefits and who it doesn't benefit. And again, a couple more points on this front. That women's reproductive systems are particularly susceptible to the hazards of toxic waste, industrial accidents. So we can see that in some societies where, let's say, the economy has collapsed, or there's been a war, or there's sanctions, as in the case of Iraq in the 1990s, we can see that it's women that are disproportionately negatively affected, and how labor itself, work, is gendered, and how it's distributed, and how, again, males tend to be in a more powerful position. And multinational corporations, MNC or transnational corporations, look for cheap labor, which tends to be women's labor. So in the garment industry, it tends to be women workers. Not always, of course. And again, this can be challenged, but this is as a rule of thumb, this is what takes place. Now, you can see an image of suffering here at the top. And there's narrative, the stories that are told about war, that it's this male quality or historically men protecting women and children. Actually, again, empirically speaking, we can see how wars themselves are perpetrated, again, especially historically, but also to some extent today, by males, by macho thinking, by this way, and actually ends up, again, disproportionately affecting people on the ground. Men as well, by the way, but of course, women and children, as this first point makes, are killed in large numbers. So arguably, from a feminist point of view, broadly speaking, wars that are created narratives of what it means to be heroic that we have from our childhood upwards, how we've been socialized to be strong, to be brave. And brave is not emotionally brave, but to be physically brave. This basically is something that again constitutes how the world is and why there's suffering in the world from a military point of view. And again, women, but again now, let's say in a more mainstream way, we can see that women are not only, let's say, in more positions of authority, whether in politics, business, non-governmental organizations, but also in the military, increasingly in some countries at least, women playing a role in fighting and fighting in wars. And arguably from a liberal feminist point of view, that's a way of showing a bit more equality. And it challenges this notion that to be male is heroic and that women can't be. More critical feminists would say, why is it that one needs to in a sense become like these male-like qualities that actually are the problem that have created instability in the world? We need to think beyond just, let's say, introducing more women into the military. But from a liberal feminist point of view, this is one way of challenging this male-dominated approach. And liberal feminists, whether in the corporate world, the business world, or the political world, says if you have more female leaders, you create more politicians, more policymakers, etc. You create the conditions for more gender equality. And more critical feminists challenge this and say, but that's just reproducing, fine, all well and good, but that's just reproducing a particular order and not challenging some of the underlying structural issues and belief systems. So militarized masculinity. So again, if you look at a film, so cultural studies now, you look at a film with John Wayne or Clint Eastwood, forgive me for using some let's say, film stars from many years ago. In the case of Clint Eastwood, still a significant film star today, but basically, or some other, let's say, tough guy figure, Bruce Willis, Sylvester Stallone. We have to be strong, we need to be tough, etc. Vin Diesel, there you go, now I'm being very modern. Cultural aspects to it. Look at how films and books reproduce a particular order and ways of seeing the world and what it means to be male and strong. Now, let me go directly back to IR, but actually militarized masculinity. Okay, how do we approach, let's say, another actor another state or non-state actor? How do we negotiate? This is no nonsense, no, let's say, talking idea that we have to fight. There's no conciliation. We have to win at all costs, etc., etc. And that is sometimes also what leads to conflict between the two sides, or continues the conflict. And women's voices, it's again increasingly, and liberal feminists would argue there's been clear steps forward here, but women's voices were not regarded as legitimate, especially in this notion of security policy. And yes, there's been changes in some societies, so liberal feminists would argue this is very positive, but not enough. And what does it mean by security? Security is particularly politico-military, this emphasis on security being that, but feminists and other critical approaches, and constructivism more broadly, would say that, and we'll be looking in next semester at foreign policy analysis, security studies, this aspect, but we need to bring in this, what's known as a human security approach. So we need to look at security is not just politico-military, but it's also physical, economic, psychological, ecological, etc. Food. Violence in all its forms can be used on many different levels. And this is something that feminists argue is the limitation of mainstream approaches, which looks at, let's say, something like national security or international security solely through the lens of politico-military. But actually, you have to look how it impacts physically, how it impacts on people. Economic implications, again, particularly for those in a less powerful, in a weaker position, a disenfranchised position. Psychological, how warfare, and warfare is not. And here you look at, let's say, people on the ground, but also soldiers themselves that have been sent to fight in another country, post-traumatic stress. This is where we bring in human security approach and how it affects the environment, literally the environment itself, through, let's say, the arms trade, the oil companies, and how they, let's say, again, make things, according to critical feminist thinkers, make things less secure rather than more secure. And we have to think about how individuals matter. And here we're not just talking about prime ministers, presidents, chancellors, CEOs, etc., but how it impacts both top down and bottom up, so in both directions, but how individuals impact on national and international politics and vice versa. And how we have to consider that people's security, again, we take security in a broader sense than just politico-military, but how people's security is impacted on many different levels. So again, a war started in the Middle East, in Central Africa, whatever the case might be. And if the policymakers are making it from a capital, let's say a neighboring country, or a capital thousands of miles away, thinking how it impacts women, children, and men on the local level is a part of what feminist thinkers and approaches do in international relations. And again, this cultural construction of what masculinity, what it means to fight against the enemy, to actually reproduce it, to protect vulnerable people, see how language is used, how we help others, how we help women, how we help children, how we help the disabled, language helps construct particular power relations. But are actually these particular categories and particular peoples being protected or not? Look at it empirically as well. And we can often see, again, feminist approaches that looks at these, also the empirical side of it, looks at how the majority of the casualties, again, end up being women and children. So disenfranchised rather than enfranchised. And again, we have to consider how military power often, not always, but often, 9 times out of 10, to use that expression, actually creates more instability, more conflict than the reverse. And feminist thinkers, and again, it's the case of, let's say, the Balkans in the 1990s. We could look at, of course, Iraq in the 1990s too, with the sanctions. But how often policymakers have created conditions that make it worse for, again, women, children, and in some cases men too. And this is the point, that it's from a critical theory perspective, if we're trying to emancipate all groups, it ends up ultimately being bad for all. But again, when we look at this notion of rape in a war situation, women are disproportionately affected. Of course, men can be raped too, to be direct with this, but disproportionately women suffer, whether in the Balkans, Central Africa, but it can be any region, of course. And here I'm citing Democratic Republic of Congo. But it can be in any case, in any society, women again are negatively affected and not being protected. So again, challenges and potential solutions. So again, insecurity is on many different levels and many different areas. And we have to think about how it affects people and people's lives. And by people, we're not just talking about those in powerful positions, but people on the ground, how they are impacted and so on. And again, we just need to go beyond this different units of analysis, states and regional or boundaries, but how, whether it's environmental, whether it's cultural, whether it's food security, whatever it is, water, whatever the case is, education, how people are impacted, whether positively or otherwise negatively. And often it's negative, but how we have to bring in this human security to approach to consider how it can help people's lives. So the United Nations Development Index looks at this more liberal feminist approach, looks at how people's lives, are women's lives, men's lives too, but are women's lives getting better, etc., etc. And again, for more critical approaches, they would say this is a start, but we need to go much further. And again, post-colonialism, Chandra Mohanty and others, we have to consider many different units analysis. So racism, the abhorrence of racism still plays a role in how people, so Black Lives Matter as an example today in the United States. But race is something that is abhorrent and socially constructed, particularly in the 19th century, by European biologists, anthropologists, etc., to have this asymmetrical relations, played a role in eugenics thinking and fascism that came in the darkness of fascism and Nazism. But how race is something that still plays a role in how we see the world and how some groups are more in a more powerful position than others. Again, class, different socioeconomic status, whether, let's say, you are representing your class, and whether the working class itself can play a role in emancipating themselves or not. So here we have some Marxist notions. And gender. Again, are females going to continue to be repressed, exploited, etc., etc.? And again, I should emphasize that it's not always the case that men are in a more powerful position than women. There might be examples where one can find in a society where women might have an advantage, let's say in the case of parental rights. But, and with that stated, 9 times out of 10, to use that expression again, we have to look at how gender is often reinforcing why men are in a privileged, more powerful position. So race, class, and gender, a more post-colonial approach to feminism. And we have to think how knowledge is used and how it can benefit not only women's lives, which is very, very important for feminist thinkers, but also that it benefits everyone. And again, I've been briefly referred to the United Nations Gender Development Index. And we can see how are women affected? What can we do? Can we measure quantitative now? And qualitative, we can see how things are understood, the meaning. But can we measure, let's say, how people's lives have got better? Are more women and men being educated, going to school, going to university, or whatever the case might be, getting particular jobs, etc., etc., making a certain life for themselves, certain index. So the United Nations Gender Development Index is something you can look at, and you can see certain societies that have improved certain conditions. And gender mainstreaming, how, let's say, an idea that might have been seen as at one stage so much out of, or let's say, the norm of a society or the mainstream of society, how certain ideas can eventually become mainstream. So, and how women, in this case gender, can actually be considered front and centered. So how international organizations, international relations now, or national governments can create something where it actually helps improve gender equality or otherwise. And again, to use an example of let's say, gender equality, and again here there would be a debate, and is a debate, let's say, about this notion of meritocracy, the best person for the job. Some feminist thinkers would say, all well and good, but 9 times out of 10, the opportunities are not there for women. And actually men are, and here we use post-colonial thinking, white, middle-class, straight men have an inherent advantage because of social networks, etc., etc. But actually, does it do something where it creates more equality for everyone? And the example I wanted to use was this notion of a quota system. Like in Norway, 40% of Norwegian parliament have to be female MPs. Why? Because that creates, in a quicker way, gender equality. And actually, according to Norwegian Parliament, and the logic to this is that it creates a more inclusive and diverse society, as an example. But again, when we look at notions of, well, when we look at quota or meritocracy, this is a big discussion. But the point is, how do we involve women as front and center to decision making, to actually improving people's lives, whether, let's say, on let's say, women having more powerful positions in public policy, but also on the ground, this grassroots aspect. And some key feminist arguments that I want you to think about, and this is very important to IR feminism. Again, and this is a very important factor, there's both gender and biology, so gender and sex, sex equaling biology. But this is key, and this is why I've put these points in red. Feminist thinking throughout the social sciences, the central claim is that gender is a social issue, a social construct, and not a biological one. So what I'm not arguing is that biology doesn't matter. Nature and nurture, they both matter. There is an aspect of both. But in the social world that we live in, gender is constructed and reconstructs particular hierarchies, particular power structures, etc., etc. And we have to think about it critically, how language, belief systems, images create that, recreate it, and how we can change things. And again, this fixed aspect, which positivism tends to put a slight factor on, when we look at international relation theory, so anarchical system, as I referred to earlier, and in the realism slides, these fixed categories and structures, they're part of the problem often rather than the solution, and they create certain hierarchies, problems, conflictual situations. So firstly, gender is a social construct, gender is a social issue. Secondly, rejection of these fixed elements or structures, and actually we are constructing, so constructivism here, we are constructing and reconstructing through our interactions, through our practices, belief systems. And thirdly, the possibility, so this emancipatory critical theory approach, the interest in the possibilities for change. Feminist thinkers can be realistic in a sense that they acknowledge that the world works the way it does and may continue to, but actually, and change is not always positive, it can be negative too, of course, but actually the positive from a normative point of view, how can we make the world at least a little bit better? How can we empower women, but all peoples? And how can we actually create structures where there is less violence, less inequalities, less hierarchy? So, interest in the possibilities for change. And it's not always the case, and we can see with state and non-state actors and social movements and individuals that actually things can get better and things can be challenged. And this is why we should challenge this notion that things are fixed. So gender is a social issue, rejection of fixed elements, and interest in the possibilities for change. Now, this is a question that I'd like you to think about. And this is a question that would be a potential presentation, as are the other questions that I have at the end of each of these presentations. So I read this to you, and then I'm going to finish this presentation. Briefly, the question, you can see George W. Bush in his 2002 West Point address. President George W. Bush claimed that brutality against women is always and everywhere wrong. This implying that brutality against women might justify war. So this universalist notion here that Bush is arguing for. Would a feminist perspective on IR agree? And I want you to think of what a feminist perspective is, the different schools of thought within feminism when you answer this question or an equivalent question. And we'll be talking more about this in class. And so again, thank you very much for your attention. And I very much look forward to talking more about feminism in class, and I wish you a lovely rest of the day or evening if you're watching it in the evening. Take care. Goodbye.